The morning began like any other in the Bellini mansion. João, the dedicated nurse, had been at his post since the early hours of the morning, ensuring that everything was in order for the family matriarch, Donna Helena Bellini. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the meticulously tended garden, when João headed to the elderly woman's room for his morning routine. Donna Helena was lying on the four-poster bed, surrounded by fine sheets and feather pillows. Her expression was one of weariness and frailty, but her eyes, despite being clouded by age and illness, still carried a striking intensity. João had always admired that woman's quiet strength. "Good morning, Donna Helena. How are you feeling today?" João asked, as he adjusted the headboard of the bed so that she would be more comfortable. "Good morning, João. I'm fine, as much as I can be," she replied with a weak smile. João began to prepare the medication, arranging the pills on a silver tray. While he worked, Donna Helena watched him closely, as if she was gathering the courage to say something important. "João, I need to talk to you about something very serious," she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "Of course, Donna Helena. Whatever you want," he replied, sitting in the chair next to the bed and holding her hand affectionately. "You know I don't have much time." She paused, searching for the right words. "There's something I'd like to ask you before I leave. Something very important to me." João was intrigued. He knew Donna Helena as a determined and pragmatic woman, but he had never seen her so emotional. "Tell me, Donna Helena. I'll do my best to fulfill your request. I want you to pretend to be my son, Roberto, for a day." The request took João by surprise. He had heard many stories about Roberto, Donna Helena's lost son, but he never imagined that she would make such an unusual request. "Mrs. Helena, I don't know what to say. I never met your son, and I know, João, but you're the closest person I have to a son right now. I need that peace before I leave, even if it's an illusion for a day." João felt a pang in his heart. He knew that Mrs. Helena's loneliness was immense, and her request, as strange as it was a desperate cry for comfort and love. "Okay, Mrs. Helena, I'll do it for you." Mrs. Helena's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Thank you, João. Let's do it on Saturday. I'll tell you everything about Roberto so you can prepare yourself." In the days that followed, Mrs. Helena spent hours telling João about Roberto. She described what he was like as a child, his mischief, his preferences, and even the difficult times they lived through. João absorbed every detail, committed to giving Mrs. Helena the joy she so desired. Finally, Saturday arrived. João dressed in an outfit chosen by Donna Helena. A blue sweater and jeans, a simple combination, but one that Roberto often wore. When he looked in the mirror, João barely recognized himself. He looked like a different person, someone with a story and a past that he was about to embody. When he entered Donna Helena's room, the impact was immediate. She was sitting on the bed, dressed and made up like she hadn't done in a long time. When she saw him, her eyes filled with tears. "Roberto, my son?" she whispered, her voice full of emotion. João felt a lump in his throat, but smiled and approached. "Mom, I'm back." From that moment on, João dedicated himself to being Roberto, providing Donna Helena with a day full of memories, laughter, and love. And although he knew that it was all an act, a part of his heart began to wonder if there was more truth in that relationship than he imagined. The days leading up to Saturday were filled with great anxiety and preparation for both João and Dona Helena. The Bellini mansion, with its imposing architecture and luxurious decor, seemed more alive than ever, as if it were waiting for a special event. Every detail had to be perfect for the big day. João spent hours listening to Dona Helena talk about Roberto. The sessions became a kind of daily ritual. She would nostalgically describe each characteristic of her son, his tastes and quirks, and recall stories from his childhood that seemed distant yet so present at the same time. It was as if, by telling these stories, Dona Helena was bringing Roberto back to life. Roberto loved the color blue. He always said that blue was the color of the sky and the sea, and that he wanted to travel the world to see every possible shade of blue, said Dona Helena, as she caressed an old photo album. João studied each photo carefully. Roberto had an infectious smile, his brown hair was always disheveled, and his eyes were bright with curiosity and enthusiasm. João made an effort to memorize every detail, every expression. He knew that, for Dona Helena, Roberto loved the color blue. Any flaw in the performance could shatter the fragile illusion she so desired. On Friday night, tension was in the air. João had spent the whole week practicing the role, but he still felt a hint of insecurity. He dressed in the clothes chosen by Dona Helena, a blue sweater and worn jeans, like the ones Roberto used to wear. He looked at himself in the mirror, trying to see himself through Dona Helena's eyes. On Saturday morning, João woke up early. The day was bright and sunny, a perfect representation of the happy stories Dona Helena told about her son. He took a long shower, trying to calm his nerves. After getting dressed, he went to Dona Helena's room. She was sitting in an armchair near the window, looking out at the garden. She was impeccably dressed, wearing a light blue silk dress, and her white hair was tied up in an elegant bun. João noticed that there was a special sparkle in her eyes, a mixture of hope and longing. "Good morning, Mom," said João, entering the room. Dona Helena turned slowly, and when she saw him, her eyes filled with tears. "Roberto, my dear." She opened her arms, and João approached, hugging her tenderly. "I'm back, Mom." The emotion in the room was palpable. Dona Helena touched João's face, as if she wanted to make sure he was real. There was a smile on her face that João had never seen before, a smile of pure happiness. "I have so many things to tell you, my son. I missed you so much," she said, her voice breaking. "I missed you too, Mom. Let's enjoy this day together." Dona Helena and João spent the morning reminiscing about moments from the past. She showed him photo albums, old letters, and small objects that she kept with care, each one with a story behind it. "Do you remember this little car, Roberto? You used to play with it all the time. It was your Christmas present when you were 5 years old." João picked up the metal card in his hands, feeling the weight of the story it carried. He struggled to remember, as if those memories could really be his. As the day progressed, they walked through the garden, where many of Roberto's memories seemed to have unfolded. Dona Helena pointed to a large, leafy tree. "That's where you fell and broke your arm. I was so desperate." She laughed softly, but with a touch of sadness. João looked at the tree, feeling a strange familiarity. He had a scar on his right arm. From a fall, he could never remember how it had happened. That coincidence made his heart race, but he kept his composure. That evening, sitting in the living room lit by a crackling fireplace, Donna Helena told stories about the trips she had planned to take with Roberto before his disappearance. João listened attentively, feeling a growing connection with those stories. It was as if, in some inexplicable way, he was rediscovering a part of himself. "We've always wanted to go to Italy, to visit the land of our ancestors," said Donna Helena, with a sparkle in her eyes. "One day, we'll make that trip, my son." João held Donna Helena's hand, feeling an intense emotion. He knew the day was coming to an end, but he also knew that this experience had changed something inside him. "We'll do it, Mom. I promise." Donna Helena smiled, a smile of pure satisfaction and peace. For the first time in many years, she felt that her life was complete. The day that João had spent pretending to be Roberto Bellini was one of the most intense of his life. Each moment seemed charged with meaning, and he did his best to immerse himself in the experience and provide Donna Helena with the comfort and joy she so desired. The morning began with a special breakfast. Donna Helena had ordered a dish that Roberto used to love, pancakes with fresh fruit and honey. As they ate, they talked about old memories. "Do you remember when you learned to ride a bike, Roberto?" asked Donna Helena, with a hint of nostalgia in her voice. "I vaguely remember, Mom," replied João, trying to evoke any fragment of memory that could resemble the story. Donna Helena smiled when she saw João's expression, as if she saw the real Roberto there, by his side. She talked about Roberto's enthusiasm in learning to ride a bike, the feeling of freedom and the joy of finally being able to ride without training wheels. João listened attentively, admiring the way she described the moments with such affection and vivacity. After breakfast, João and Donna Helena decided to take a walk in the garden. The weather was perfect, with mild sunshine and a gentle breeze. The garden was a reflection of the Bellini family's good taste and wealth, perfectly manicured, with a variety of exotic flowers and plants. Donna Helena showed João the areas of the garden that Roberto helped to take care of when he was a child. Younger, she pointed to a rose bush, saying, "This was your favorite rose bush. You always said that roses were like life, sometimes thorny, but always beautiful." John examined the rose bush, trying to absorb the meaning of the analogy. As they walked, Mrs. Helena continued to share stories, each one more detailed and rich in emotion than the last. When they reached that large tree mentioned earlier, the conversation took on a more personal tone. Mrs. Helena described Roberto's fall and the concern she felt at the time. John touched the tree with a deep feeling, almost as if the feel of the rough bark connected him to Roberto's past. "This is where you got hurt," Mrs. Helena said, her eyes sad. "I remember clearly how I ran to help you." John tried to imagine the scene, the desperation of a mother running to help her son. He looked at the tree and, for a moment, felt as if he were connecting with a part of his own identity. Upon returning to the mansion, Donna Helena prepared a small box of memories that Roberto had left behind. Inside were old toys, letters, and a diary. Donna Helena opened the diary and read a few passages, revealing Roberto's thoughts and dreams when he was young. João, moved, leafed through the pages, absorbing the words of a young man he had never met, but to whom he now felt an inexplicable connection. The pages spoke of dreams of adventure, worries about school, and love for his family. João tried to put himself in Roberto's shoes, feeling a deep empathy for the boy he had once been. That evening, as the light from the fireplace softly illuminated the living room, João, and Dona Helena sat together to reflect on the day. Dona Helena looked exhausted but content. She curled up in a comfortable chair, a smile on her face. "It was a wonderful day, Roberto," she said, her voice full of gratitude. "I felt like time had gone backwards." João, sitting next to her, held Dona Helena's hand. "I'm happy to know that I was able to provide this for you. It was a day that I will also remember fondly." Dona Helena closed her eyes for a moment, enjoying the feeling of having her son, even if only for a day. João, in turn, felt a mix of emotions. He was touched by the depth of Dona Helena's desire and by the connection he had formed with Roberto's stories. The evening progressed with a feeling of completion and contentment. Dona Helena was calmer than in the previous days, while João felt transformed by the experience. It was as if he had touched something deep inside himself, a glimpse of a life that had never been entirely his, but that, somehow, was now part of him. The morning after the emotional day of memories began with a feeling of lightness and satisfaction for both of them. Dona Helena was calmer and more serene, and João was introspective, reflecting on what he had experienced. However, something inexplicable was happening to João, something that was beginning to arouse a mixture of strangeness and curiosity. While they were preparing breakfast, João felt a vague discomfort, a feeling of déjà vu, which he could not explain. He was in the kitchen, preparing the meal according to Dona Helena's instructions, when he was struck by a flash of memory, a fleeting moment from his childhood, involving a garden and a tree. It was a hazy memory, as if he were watching a scene from an old, faded movie. Dona Helena entered the kitchen with a smile, noticing João's worried expression. "Are you okay, Roberto? You seem a little distracted," she asked, her voice full of concern. "I'm just a little tired, Mom." "It was a long night," João replied, trying to hide his uneasiness. After breakfast, João and Dona Helena decided to take another stroll through the garden. Dona Helena seemed excited to continue the journey of memories. When they reached the big tree, she began to talk about the day Roberto fell. "You were so stubborn, Roberto. I had to stay behind you the whole time to make sure you didn't hurt yourself. I remember clearly when you wanted to climb that tree," she said, pointing to the big tree with a nostalgic smile. John approached the tree, observing it more closely. He felt a chill as he touched the rough bark. Something about that tree seemed familiar in a way he couldn't explain. The touch of the bark brought up a stronger sense of déjà vu, almost as if he had experienced a similar scene in the distant past. As they walked through the garden, John began to remember vague moments from his childhood. He saw flashes of an old house, a similar tree, and an environment that seemed to match Dona Helena's descriptions. These flashes of memory were interspersed with the feeling that he was reliving something he shouldn't know. He hesitated to share these feelings with Dona Helena, fearing that she might interpret it as part of the performance. However, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of familiarity and connection to the past that he was experiencing. The following afternoon, as they explored more of Roberto's room of memories, Dona Helena brought out Roberto's diary again. João flipped through the pages, reading the young Roberto's notes and thoughts. There was one particularly interesting page that mentioned a trip that Roberto had dreamed of taking. "I've always wanted to visit Italy. My dreams are there, and one day I hope we can go," read an entry dated a few months before his disappearance. Something about the entry caught João's attention. He had a strange feeling, as if this aspiration was familiar to him, as if he himself had dreamed of something similar in his childhood. He wondered if these memories were emerging due to the influence of the stories he was hearing, or if there was a deeper connection. During dinner, as they talked about the dream trip mentioned in the diary, João could not hide his uneasiness. Dona Helena noticed the change in his behavior and asked with concern, "Roberto, are you okay? You seem worried." "I'm just thinking about what you told me. Those stories are so vivid, so real. Sometimes I feel like I'm really there with you." Dona Helena smiled understandingly, interpreting João's uneasiness as an emotional depth. But for João, it was more than that. It was a feeling that he was touching something very deep and personal, a connection that transcended simple acting. Night fell and João tried to sleep, but the disconcerting sensations continued to disturb his sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind filled with confused thoughts about the tree, the diary, and the vaguely familiar memories. As he stared at the ceiling, he realized that the sense of familiarity he was experiencing was not just a trick of the mind. Something was happening, and he was beginning to believe that there was more truth hidden behind Roberto's memories than he had initially imagined. The chapter ended with João determined to discover what was causing these feelings and to connect the dots between Roberto's past and his own life. At the beginning of the 5th chapter, the morning was marked by a silence filled with anticipation. João felt that something was about to happen, a discovery that could change everything. The restlessness he was experiencing was not just a result of the role-playing, but something deeper, linked to old memories that seemed to have been awakened. The day began with João deciding to return to the tree in the garden. He felt an urgent need to investigate that feeling of familiarity further. He walked there alone, without Dona Helena present, and began to examine the tree more closely. With his hands, João touched the bark, trying to feel for any hint of something hidden. The sensation was of something more than simple wood. It was almost as if he was touching an old memory. He bent down and began to dig lightly around the base of the tree, looking for anything that might have been buried. After some careful digging, John found something partially buried. It was a small metal box, covered in dirt and debris. Sweating with excitement and effort, he removed it and cleaned it. The box was old, but it seemed well preserved. With shaking hands, John opened the box and found inside a collection of old objects, faded photographs, a small medal, and a few handwritten letters. There was also a framed photo of a child with an infectious smile. The child's face was unmistakably similar to John's. John examined the letters, one by one. The first, dated decades ago, was signed by someone named George and mentioned a deep friendship with someone who lived in an old house near the tree. The writing was from someone who seemed to know the Bellini family very well. Another, more recent letter appeared to be a lost correspondence, mentioning a meeting and a family reunion. The tone of the letters was personal and emotional, suggesting a deep bond and perhaps even a forced separation. The last letter was an invitation to a special event in Italy, which mentioned the desire to find a lost son. João felt a chill down his spine as he read the letters. The invitation to Italy and the reference to a lost son echoed the same aspiration he had read in Roberto's diary. The photo of the child seemed to reflect an unsettling resemblance to himself. With the box in hand, João returned to Dona Helena's room, who was reading a book in the living room. He watched her for a moment, hesitant. "I am about to reveal what I had discovered," The weight of the revelation made him feel like he was on the verge of something very significant. "Mrs. Helena, I found something in the garden that I think you should see," said John, trying to remain calm. Mrs. Helena looked up from her book, curious and concerned. She followed him to the bedroom, where John placed the box on the table. He began to show the items he had found, explaining what he had found. "Look, this is an old photo. And these letters," John pointed to the items, while Mrs. Helena's expression changed from curiosity to shock. She picked up the photo and examined it, her eyes widening as the details began to fit together. Mrs. Helena began to read the letters, and her face went through a series of emotions: surprise, confusion, and finally, a painful recognition. This is incredible. I never thought I would see this again," said Mrs. Helena, her voice shaking. Dona Helena revealed that Jorge was an old family friend who had drifted apart due to a dispute. Jorge had been an important figure in Roberto's life, but after a painful separation, he disappeared from the family circle. Roberto and Jorge were like brothers. "Jorge left and we never saw him again," Dona Helena explained. "He always talked about wanting to find a lost son, but I never knew he was referring to anyone other than Roberto." João was perplexed. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but there were still many unanswered questions. The similarity to the photo and the connection to Jorge suggested that João might be linked to the story in a more direct way than he imagined. "Dona Helena, I don't know how to explain it, but the resemblance between the child in the photo and me is frightening. And the invitation to Italy, it's starting to make sense in a way I can't fully understand." Dona Helena looked at him with a mixture of concern and hope. "Maybe it's time to find out the truth, Roberto. Perhaps these discoveries will lead us to the answers we have been searching for so long." The chapter ended with João and Dona Helena deciding that they should investigate the connection with Jorge and the invitation to Italy further. The next step would be to find out more information about Jorge and discover what really happened to him and the connection with the Bellini family. They began to prepare for the trip to Italy, determined to unearth the truth about the past and to face the mystery that now seemed to surround João's very identity. The next day, João confronted Dona Helena with the photo. She stared at the image, her expression alternating between disbelief and hope. "Mom," João began, but his voice broke. Dona Helena grabbed the photo, tears streaming down her face. "Roberto, is it really you?" João, still confused, hugged Dona Helena. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The adoption, the repressed memories, everything made sense now. He was, in fact, Roberto Bellini, Dona Helena's long-lost son. With the help of documents and testimonies, the truth was revealed. Roberto had been kidnapped as a child and taken far away, where he was eventually adopted under the name João. The initial shock gave way to restrained joy and a sea of emotions. Dona Helena, although fragile, seemed to have gained new energy. João, now Roberto, struggled to assimilate the truth, but Dona Helena's love and acceptance comforted him. Roberto decided to stay in the mansion, taking care of Dona Helena and making up for lost time. The Bellini family, surprised by the return of their heir, welcomed him back with a mixture of distrust and joy. Life in the mansion changed, and the shadows of the past began to dissipate. Over time, Roberto and Dona Helena rebuilt their relationship. The days were filled with stories, laughter, and affection. Roberto, now sure of his identity, helped manage the family business, bringing a new perspective. But not everything was perfect. The secrets and intrigues that surrounded the Bellini family were yet to come to light, and with them, new twists and turns. One day, while searching through the family's old documents, Roberto found something shocking: a letter written by his father, dated shortly before his disappearance. In the letter, he confessed a dark secret that could change the history of the Bellini family forever and bring to light long-buried truths.